be back to this very, very close fight that will take place in about 6 states, and frankly in the suburbs of about half a dozen to a dozen metro areas in 6 states. And the entire election will come down to about 200,000 to 400,000 voters.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the USSC. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. We are 1 year out from the 2024 US presidential election. If we ignore the actuarial possibilities of something that completely derails the polling reports we're seeing, it will be a 2020 repeat of Trump v. Biden. What are Presidents Trump and Biden like behind the scenes and on the campaign trail? Has MAGA won enough of the hearts and minds of the Republican Party that it represents the new Republican paradigm? What's truly at stake in this election? To take a deep dive into these issues on the USSC Briefing Room, I'm joined by Chief Washington Correspondent for Politico, Lizza, and Washington Correspondent for New York Magazine Olivia Nuzzi. Ryan is host and executive producer of the weekly Political Deep Dive podcast and has written for numerous U.S. outlets, including The Washington Post, The New York Times, and The Atlantic. He has covered every presidential election since 2000, and his reporting on President Obama won the White House Correspondents Association Aldo Beckman Award. And Olivia has also written for major U.S. outlets, including The Washington Post, Politico, GQ, and The Daily Beast. In 2020, she signed the Harper's letter alongside Salman Rushdie, Margaret Atwood, Gloria Steinem, and other prominent writers and intellectuals. She also won the National Magazine Award for Journalists Under 30, and she was a finalist for the National Magazine Award for Feature Writing earlier this year. Now, at the end of this episode, we'll get our by-the-numbers stat related to U.S. presidential elections or coverage. Are you guys good to go on that?
We got it, yes.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, let's dive in. So I'd like to start off with former President Trump, because you've both interviewed him before. So what is he like in that smaller, more intimate setting? Is the version that we see on TV similar to or different from the Trump that you met?
It really depends. I first interviewed him, I think, in 2014, and I've interviewed him as a candidate, as president, and as a former president, and as a candidate again now.
That's a lot of times.
And
Circle of life.
Circle of life. And I find when you see him up close, when there are a lot of other people around, he's pretty much just as you would expect, just as he is on television. But when you're sitting one-on-one with him, sometimes you get him and he's very monotone. Not a lot of inflection, not a lot of grandiose bloviating the way that he does on a rally stage. Almost frankly seems kind of medicated, just flat.
Sleepy Trump.
Yeah. Well, it's weird because it's not exactly like he's tired. It's just like a non-responsive sort of flatness. I don't know how else to describe it. It's very jarring when you encounter that Donald Trump. And then other times he's in this sort of charming mode where he's very avuncular, really wants your approval in the conversation, wants you on his side, and is sort of engaging you in that way on that level, almost like a normal person might be at like a cocktail party, let's say. And then when he's on the defensive, when you're asking him questions that he doesn't like, that's when he's most like, I think, the Trump that people are used to in kind of popular culture and from what we see on television.
Yeah, I agree with that. The subdued Trump, and you hear other people describe this. It's a common thing. It's almost, I think most entertainers have this, where you're used to seeing them on stage doing their shtick, And so that becomes what what you associate with. So we all know that Trump, like the Trump of a Trump rally. And so when you see him up close or in person or in an interview, and he's not fully embodying that character, you are taken aback at first, and it's like, wait a second, this is a whole different speed. And so that different speed, when he's not fully embodying that character, can be anywhere from just, like Olivia said, medicated, where you're like, he's very low spoken and, surprisingly, a lot of people don't. A common critique of him is that he's not really interested in asking you questions when
really.
He
I'm shocked.
That's a hot take, Ryan.
But there's a little bit more of that.
Okay.
And he wants to find out. Like, we interviewed him jointly once, and he was very interested in sort of like, he wanted to know, like, what's the deal with these two? Like, so he was kind of he had a certain curiosity, but he was very low energy. And
no one besides our family members, I think, have asked us if we're getting married and when we're getting married as much as he did in that interview.
He's like a gossip.
He's a gossip, and he wants the dirt. He wants the inside scoop, basically. But it's interesting you say that about, public figures, performers, when you see them on a stage. I think Trump, more than probably most other politicians or most modern presidents, he is so much more like Elvis than he is like, Jimmy Carter. And so there's this sort of like almost, it's almost like he gets his energy from the number of people who are around him, and the fewer people who are around him, then the lower his energy levels are. That's almost what it's like. There's this sort of inflation relative to the crowd size.
And if you think about this is very common with, like, I don't know if you've ever seen a documentary about any rock star or I'm not trying to compare him to a rock star, but or any stage actor. They have that, like, they save all of the energy for the show, right? So I think that's the big difference.
I don't even think it's that he's saving it, though. I think it's that he's like, he draws that energy from the people around him. Like, that's why he requires a crowd, and it's why he wants to do these rallies constantly, even when there's no actual political justification for a MAGA rally, right? Even in times when there aren't actually campaigns.
He just wants to be out there.
He wants to be out there, and he wants to be, I remember talking to his aides before the 2020 election, and he wasn't on the road much because of COVID. They were sort of doing these, I think it was in the period right before they started doing the rallies again. And even those rallies were sort of pared back because of the pandemic. And I remember his aides telling me that every day he was just calling and asking, what does it feel like out there? What do they feel like? Tell me, like, what the vibes are, basically. And I think he, more than most people ever on earth, and certainly more than most politicians, sort of requires opportunities to pick up on vibes, frankly.
And then, there's like now that we've talking about this for a few seconds, I'm trying to think through, like, the different categories. There's like the public Trump, right? And that's like the MAGA rally Trump. There's the private Trump, who can be, like, in air quotes here, normal. Okay. And it's just like this kind of like gossipy, weird New Yorker. And then there's like interview Trump. Like, when you start asking him tough questions and he turns into this, he starts, slinging the bullshit and getting his back up about every issue and jumping from one non sequitur to another and going into the diatribes and, his sort of set pieces about any subject you bring up.
And all in an effort because he's producing the interview in his mind, right?
Well, that's going to be my question.
Yeah.
Is that an intentional tactic on his part, or is it just a response, a reaction?
It's definitely
and
intentional.
He flips between the two, because I remember last time when we interviewed him together, I was just thinking this through now.
Yeah.
He flipped between that just like calm, subdued Trump, and then you're like,
so
tell us, let's talk about the insurrection.
Yeah.
And, just getting his back up.
Yeah. And you could tell where he's sort of gaming it out. And I mean, he's thinking strategically about how to manage the situation, how to manage the show of the interview, basically. I remember he has this weird thing always when he's in interviews, and sometimes in public too, where he just repeats himself over and over and over again. And I remember talking to our friend Maggie Haberman when her book about Trump was coming out, I guess it was last year, right? Confidence Man. And she said, she finally asked him, like, why do you repeat yourself so much when you talk to me? And I remember the first time I interviewed him, he repeated maybe a dozen times in the interview that he had made a lot of money in Atlantic City, and he wanted me to tell my readers that Mr. Trump made a lot of money in Atlantic City. And so I sort of printed it verbatim, with all of these different quotes from him saying the same thing. And when Maggie, I'm paraphrasing, but she told me that she asked him about it, and he said, it's to beat it into your beautiful brain. It's just, the idea is if you're doing a print interview, if you say the same thing enough times to the writer, they will get the message that that's important to note.
Or that's the only thing they've said, and so there's only one thing to write.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Now, Olivia, you in particular have had, many personal interviews with President Trump, from your My Private Oval Office press conference interview for New York Magazine in 2018 to your interviews with him before and after his 2024 announcement, including spending a fair bit of time at Mar-a-Lago. Can you take us behind the scenes a bit of the Trump orbit? And how do these sorts of interviews come about in the first place?
Well, the one that you're referencing from 2018, it came about completely randomly, and I had no idea it would be happening. I just happened to be in the White House for some other interviews and meetings. And I think, if memory serves, it was like some question or something I said in one of my interviews with one of his aides. They called him, or they went in to see him and told him about it, and he asked for me to be brought in. And so I had 15 seconds between realizing what was happening and then sitting down with him. And that one, that whole thing, it was this weird orchestrated sort of play where all of these different people kept coming into the Oval Office, and it was like Trump doing a weird presentation, and the point of it was to tell me that everything was going really well and that he was not about to fire his then chief of staff. And of course, ultimately, he did fire the chief of staff. And, it was very strange, and it sort of worked in one sense. I didn't write the exact story that I was there taking meetings about. But it was very similar to like my earliest interview with him, before the White House, before he was even running for president, in 2016, when that was just something that he was sort of putting out into the ether, as he always did, for decades, that he was maybe going to be running. I remember I asked an aide to connect me, and I called his secretary, and she patched me through in a few seconds. I remember I was in a cab when I was doing that interview. It was just sort of very random, and because he had an opening in his day, because he can always find time to receive attention.
Yeah.
And then the more recent interviews were really just a matter of reaching out and asking if he would do it. He had not yet publicly announced his decision last summer about whether or not he was going to run. And he sort of used the opportunity with New York Magazine to say that he had already made up his mind, but that he was not yet ready to tell us whether or not he was going to run. And then a few months later, I think it was in December of 2022, it was just at the beginning of this presidential campaign. He had already announced at Mar-a-Lago, and it was this sort of sad, strange event where some of his family members were not even in attendance. He's just sort of surrounded by yes men and kind of the Z-list of the kind of MAGA orbit. And he was very defensive and very worried about the perception that he was all alone at Mar-a-Lago and not running a real campaign. But at that point, he really was not running a real campaign, and was just sort of at home waiting for things to take off and trying to avoid prosecution.
Well, and here we are.
And he was very angry about it. Yeah, he was very angry about it in the end.
Wow. And Ryan, I think one of the things that was so unsettling about the Trump presidency was that it directly followed the Obama administration, was so completely different. And you've got a lot of experience in reporting on the Obama administration. Can you contrast what you saw of President Obama with what then followed with President Trump?
The ways in which Trump disrupted every norm of American politics, that's a long, long list when it goes to relationships with the press, to how he dealt with Congress, to how he communicated with the American public, to his personal decisions about staffing his administration, to how he dealt with and treated allies and non-allies. So, basically everything about the presidency was a break with the recent past.
He was a normal, well-adjusted adult.
Trump?
Obama. Are you kidding? Obama, right? And then you go to this person with a personality disorder and probably one of the weirdest people in history.
Yeah. I will say the thing that I used to not really believe, but I think in hindsight is true, is that one of the critics of Obama that anti-Obama and anti-Trump conservatives would like to make is that the celebrityification of the American presidency, that maybe you could argue Obama, it reached its peak, but of course there were precedents like Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, right? Everyone is the celebrity culture of America, and bleeding into our politics is a long running thing. But I would say a lot of people that they argued that, Obama helped usher the way for Trump in that, he was this media star more than a political, traditional political animal. So, you could probably debate that, and maybe that's unfair, an unfair comparison. But that is, that's one way in which maybe there was some continuity in just how celebrified our politics has become, right?
And I mean, so in Australia, President Obama was massively popular.
Yeah.
I wish I had the stat right off the top of my head, but it's in polling, it was something like he had an 80 or 90% approval rate with, the Australian audience. He was so popular. Biden is not on.
He's not on that level.
That level. I mean, he's they prefer Biden to Trump, but I think the almost approval rating he has from our survey that just came out is similar to what we're seeing in the American public. I think.
Oh, interesting. Really?
I think so. I should.
Wow,
that's interesting.
That's really interesting, actually. As
well.
Yeah,
because I mean, obviously, in general, Australian politics, they're more comfortable with the kinds of things that would be considered socialized healthcare in America or things like that. There's the daylight between the two parties in the major parties in Australia is far more narrow than what you have in America.
It's
and
been
in general,
fascinating
it's more
to watch. There was a debate on Sky News to watch a conservative host attack a politician for not sufficiently supporting the safety net here, where in America that would never happen. I mean, just would never happen, where you have a conservative saying we have to better fund or better run our safety net and help the elderly. I mean, you are more likely to have a conservative politician push an elderly person down a flight of stairs in America than argue something like that. So that has been fascinating to watch in the couple of days that we've been here so far.
I think I understand the interest in American politics here in Australia is because your politics is so settled and civilized compared to ours.
It's our soap opera.
Because of compulsory voting, the extremes seem limited. The fact that your districts are drawn by professional committees rather than completely gerrymandered.
Yeah, it's very different. Actually, if you guys went to the equivalent of, the DMV, but here it would be, it used to be the RTA, or now it's in our state services, New South Wales, but there's a concierge that meets you when you go in, and they assist you and help you find you. There's a computer screen. Oh, okay, you do this. Click this button. Oh, this is the service.
The fact that there's even the word concierge is used at the DMV is amazing. I will say I've been to the DMV many times in Washington D.C. and it's a relatively painless experience. So it's that some states have that figured out, and Washington is one of them.
But I feel like that
Even though we're
does
not a
skew
state.
We're not a state.
the Australian perception of government, and if government is running something, is different. If Americans
Right.
thought, oh, if they run our hospitals will be like the DMV,
Right.
and that's terrible. That's a horrible idea. Whereas in Australia, they're like, this is great. We love it. Why wouldn't you?
You have lots of examples of the government running things well.
Yes.
What you're saying.
Yes.
And that's
And there's general support, and that builds trust. And we saw that why everyone was happy to get vaccinated. You had like 95% vaccination rates and things.
and you pay for this too with high taxes.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Fewer hospital bills. Now, Olivia, we currently have a Biden presidency whose approval rates have consistently hovered around 40% for the last 2 years, similar to what we saw with Trump, but I believe he had more volatility. Is what we're seeing with Biden's approval rate impacting his approach to the campaign trail this time around, or do you feel like it's like, slow and steady, or it's similar to what we saw in 2020?
Well, I mean, I think in 2020, it was just a campaign against Donald Trump, right? With a big primary field first that he had to get through. A lot of candidates who, at least the media thought, would be viable. People like Pete Buttigieg or Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren, or for a brief, fleeting, beautiful moment, Mike Bloomberg. So it's different. I mean, at this stage, it's obviously quite different because the Democratic primary on the Democratic side, because the Democratic primary does not really exist in that way. We have Gene Phillips, a congressman
from my home state of Minnesota. You're welcome.
Who just got in. I don't know, Ryan, is there polling on that yet or not externally?
Since we've been here, I have not seen a poll of, I think most of the polling is going to start with New Hampshire because that's where he's making his claim. But
not yet, right?
By the time this comes out, there might be polling, but as of us sitting here recording,
and there just hasn't been
yet.
much polling in general of the Democratic primary because it barely exists. And the other candidate there is Marianne Williamson, who's polling at 10-11% nationally against Biden. And the White House obviously, at least, is pretending that they don't really care or not paying much attention to either candidate. There's not really a path forward for either candidate because of the GNC rules. No one can get delegates in New Hampshire. So even though you have these candidates on the ballot, it doesn't make a difference. But in terms of how he's approaching it, I mean, if it is indeed Biden versus Trump again, I think the argument will be pretty much the same. I think the only difference is that, there are some legislative accomplishments that Biden can talk about now. Whether or not that could really motivate voters, whether or not voters know what the CHIPS Act is, I think that's a different question entirely. And I think, it's been a pretty volatile couple of years economically in America, pretty volatile couple of years in general. And I don't know how compelling those sort of legislative achievements that maybe have not trickled down to have real life effects on people when they're going to a grocery store that's hit by inflation and they're struggling to kind of just get by every day. I don't know how much that will really matter. But I think if it's just a repeat of 2020, the messaging will be pretty similar. I think it might be more like 2016 though, in some ways, than 2020. If you don't have a sort of organizing crisis like the pandemic. But I don't know. What do you think, Ryan?
I agree with all that. I think the approval rating issue is an interesting question because I think, if you're Dean Phillips, who has decided that Democrats are making a huge mistake, that Biden is very, very vulnerable, that it is true that these polls show, serious reservations, even among many Democrats, about his age and whether he's the best candidate to nominate. And so that's what drove Phillips to get into this race, is that the Democratic elites and elected officials have sort of closed ranks around Biden, and they're ignoring this an electorate that is saying, no, we don't want this. We want another choice. This is a bad idea. And, I think the view from the Biden world is this is what happens to every incumbent president at this point. They have challenges, and we just live in a world where no national politician stays popular. They all sink down into the low 40s at some point, just as Obama did, just as Trump did. And this is sort of the world we're living in now.
If I may, it's not as if people voted for Joe Biden last time because they loved Joe Biden. They just can't get enough of Joe Biden. The pitch from Biden was in part, vote for me so you can sort of forget about the fact that there's a president for a few days. You don't have to wake up terrified about what
check the Twitter feed.
Exactly. There will be at least an adult in charge again, and people can sort of breathe a bit easier. So I don't know. I guess it's like, they all get less popular, but it's never really been about enthusiasm for Biden so much as it's been enthusiasm for not Donald Trump.
Yeah. And so last question before I get your by the numbers stat, but in a Trump v. Biden matchup based purely on campaigns, I guess their campaignability more than even electability, and not based on what we see in the polls, but just based on like the campaign trajectory that you see for both of them, who do you think would come out on top?
It's hard to separate Donald Trump from Donald Trump's campaign, right? So all of the messaging, all of the narrativizing comes from him. And I kind of believe in his ability to advertise. So I guess I would rate him pretty highly.
Trump.
Yeah.
I would say the last time around, just on purely, I'm trying to narrow your question down to the campaign tactics and nuts and bolts. It did. This is sort of an easy one to call in hindsight because Biden won. but if you just look back to who made more mistakes and was better organized on a number of metrics, Biden was. Just one small thing, like Trump discouraged vote by mail,
right?
which definitely hurt him in 2020. And it does seem
that's
like
not an organizational thing, right? That's a candidate thing.
Yeah, that's true. It does flow from him. Yeah. And it does seem that what we're seeing right now in the primaries is that Trump has a more quote unquote professional campaign operation, certainly than he did in the primaries in 2016.
But for context, the campaign operation in 2016 was like 3 guys and a clipboard, and 2 of the guys are now in jail.
Yeah, I think you have to assume that there's going to be 2 campaigns where both parties, and I think by the general election, a lot of the doubts among Democrats will be much, much lessened. The 75% support among Democrats for Biden right now, which is historic, that's low. I think the electorate will polarize. Democrats will come home to Biden. They'll be very united around him. Similarly, all the Republicans will be united around Trump, and we'll be back to this very, very close fight that will take place in about 6 states, and frankly, in the suburbs of about half a dozen to a dozen metro areas in 6 states, and the entire election will come down to about 200,000 to 400,000 voters in those places in the suburbs.
Wow.
And it will be in that sense a bit of a replay of 2020, with the one big question mark being third-party candidates. Because I think the difference between 2016 and 2020 that often doesn't get mentioned is voters who really didn't like Hillary Clinton and really didn't like Donald Trump, they broke for Trump at the end. He was kind of the more unknown quantity, and sort of a sense of, I'll give this guy, I hate them both, but I'll give this guy a shot. And some of those on the left had a Green Party candidate to go to if they didn't like Hillary Clinton.
Jill Stein.
Exactly. In 2020, the big difference was those anti-Biden and anti-Trump voters broke for Biden, and there was also no third-party option for them to park themselves. So I know a lot of Democratic strategists point to this fact as really, really important, and it leads me to my by the numbers.
Yeah, well, I was going to segue there anyway. So yeah, what have you got for us?
Because so Democrats are worried about a third party on the left, and Robert Kennedy Jr. is running as an independent. It's not easy to do that. You'd have to get on the ballot in a lot of states, and that's hard to do. But the number I was going to throw out for the end here is 22%. And that's a new, as we sit here, at least new Quinnipiac poll. Kennedy is polling at 22% in a 3-person race with Biden and Trump. But interestingly, he's drawing, according to that poll, he is actually drawing more from Trump than Biden at this point.
And I know that was the big question, is who would he pull from more? Because in American elections, really, you do have the spoiler effect with the third-party candidates.
Yes.
And so it's like, well, who is he spoiling it for? And it's just so interesting. Is it Kennedy?
He's
wild, a Democrat
right?
until, a month ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, pulling more from Trump. There you go. I'll be interested. So we'll watch his trajectory.
You will watch his trajectory.
He's polling way better than, DeSantis or Nikki Haley or anyone.
Yeah, in a 3-way. I mean, those guys aren't being, those candidates aren't
They're
being.
just in the GOP. Also.
Yeah.
I know, but if you
primary.
were to throw them in the mix.
But you're right. That's a higher number than they're getting against Trump in a primary. So as a third-party candidate, so it's, so that's a dynamic to watch.
How about you, Olivia? What stat have you got for us?
My number is 91. It's the number of charges filed against Donald Trump in the 4 criminal probes into his conduct in Manhattan, in Georgia, and the 2 federal cases. And those charges, how they play out, will determine whether or not he becomes the nominee, perhaps, and certainly whether he wins a second term at the White House. So all of our attempts to predict what's going to happen over the next year, we sort of can't do that until we have some clarity about how these cases will play out.
Yeah, and that really is the number hanging over all of this, isn't it?
Yeah. So what effect is that going to have on it still could have an effect on the Republican primaries. You never know.
It hasn't yet. Well, it has had an effect. It's had a positive effect.
Well, anytime something's going wrong for him, it's just like, man, maybe he should get indicted again. Like,
he's going to start finding opportunities. Yeah.
Going to start committing petty crimes.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast. And as we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. Our USSC Live podcast runs breakdowns from our major live events, which means coming up soon, we'll be sharing the recording of Ryan and Olivia on our panel discussion from the Sydney International Strategy Forum. So keep tuned in for that. We also have our breakdown of the GOP candidate presidential debate. And you can also check out our Technology and Security podcast, TS, run by the inaugural Director of Emerging Technology, Dr. Mia Hammond-Airy. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Ryan and Olivia, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having us at this august institution. We really appreciate it.